Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Cass Randolph had dreamed of peace on his secluded land, but his new neighbor turned that dream into a nightmare. What started with trespassing and felled trees soon escalated into arson, threats, and a deadly confrontation. But Cass isn't one to back down, and this war will have only one winner. Cassian Cass Randolph had always dreamed of owning a secluded property where he could live peacefully, away from the constraints of city life. A skilled software engineer in his early 40s, he had spent years saving up to buy a 20-acre estate nestled in the rolling hills of North Carolina. The land was perfect: dense woodlands, a winding creek, and a custom-built cabin that he had designed himself. For the past 4 years, Cass had enjoyed an idyllic life, growing his own vegetables, tending to his dogs, and working remotely from his sunlit office with a view of nature. That peace came to an abrupt halt the day Gary Vendorn moved in. Gary, a grizzled 50-year-old former real estate developer, had once been a big player in the construction business, but his empire had crumbled under the weight of multiple lawsuits and financial mismanagement. With his reputation tarnished and his funds dwindling, he had retreated to this rural area, purchasing a property adjacent to Cass's land. He made no effort to introduce himself, but Cass didn't mind. He wasn't the type to meddle in other people's lives. Unfortunately, Gary didn't share that mindset. The first warning sign appeared a week after Gary moved in. Cass woke up to the sound of chainsaws roaring just beyond his tree line. He threw on his jacket, grabbed his phone, and stormed toward the noise. His heart sank as he saw several large oaks and pines toppled over, their stumps still oozing fresh sap. A group of workers stood nearby, tossing logs into the back of a truck. Cass approached them, his voice sharp. "What the hell is going on here?" One of the men, a wiry guy in a neon vest, shrugged. "Your neighbor hired us. Said he wanted a clearer view." Cass's blood boiled. This was his land. The trees had been growing there for decades, acting as a natural barrier between the properties. Furious, he marched straight to Gary's house. The man was waiting for him on the porch, beer in hand, as if nothing was wrong. "You cut down my trees," Cass said, struggling to keep his temper in check. Gary smirked. "Calm down. They were blocking the light on my side. I did you a favor." Cass took a deep breath, trying to stay rational. "That was private property. You can't just tear down someone else's trees." Gary waved dismissively. "You've got plenty left. What's the big deal?" Cass clenched his jaw. He wasn't about to let this slide. Without another word, he turned on his heel and called his lawyer. Within 2 days, Cass had a professional land surveyor confirm that the felled trees had, without question, been on his land. He filed a formal complaint and demanded $15,000 in damages, a sum that covered both the lost trees and the cost of replanting new ones. Gary, taken aback, fought back hard. He tried to argue that the survey was wrong, that the trees were on the property line, but the evidence was irrefutable. Cass won. Gary was forced to pay up, though the process took weeks, with him dragging his feet at every opportunity. But Cass had made a critical mistake. He had humiliated Gary. Gary didn't take losses well. From that day forward, the tension between the two men solidified into an unspoken war. Cass had merely wanted what was rightfully his, but in Gary's eyes, he had been challenged, and Gary had no intention of backing down. Cass had dealt with difficult people before, but something about Gary felt different. The man radiated a particular kind of resentment, the kind that festered beneath the surface, waiting for an excuse to explode. Cass had won the first battle over the trees, but deep down, he knew the war was far from over. It started with small inconveniences, things that on their own seemed minor, but collectively painted a clear picture of Gary's growing hostility. Cass would wake up to find his trash cans tipped over, their contents scattered across his driveway. His mailbox was mysteriously dented. A few times he found beer bottles smashed near the entrance of his private road. At first, he dismissed it as a coincidence. The area had its share of wildlife, and accidents happened. But then, the stakes escalated. One morning, Cass stepped outside and froze. A mountain of garbage bags, filled with food scraps, broken furniture, and even old car parts, had been dumped at the edge of his property. The smell of rotting waste hit him immediately. Cass didn't even need to guess who was behind it. Furious, he checked his security cameras, which he had installed after the tree incident. Sure enough, the footage showed Gary's truck pulling up in the dead of night, Headlights off before he and some unknown man offloaded the trash. Cass wasted no time. He sent the footage to the local authorities and filed a formal complaint for illegal dumping. Gary received a $2,500 fine from the county's environmental services. And while Cass knew the money itself wasn't a major issue for Gary, the public record of the violation would sting. Gary's response? Escalation. Days after the fine, Cass noticed his garden hose had been slashed. Then, his truck's tires mysteriously lost air overnight. The local repair shop confirmed it wasn't a puncture from debris. Someone had let the air out intentionally. Cass knew confronting Gary directly would be pointless. The man was playing dirty, but Cass had evidence and was willing to use it. Instead of retaliating in anger, Cass took another approach. He documented everything, gathering photos and logs of every incident. He sent multiple reports to the local sheriff's office, making sure there was a paper trail linking Gary to the pattern of harassment. Then, Cass did something that he knew would infuriate Gary even more. He filed for a restraining order. It was a calculated move. The court didn't grant a full order of protection immediately, but they did issue a formal warning stating that if further incidents occurred, the sheriff's office would have cause to investigate harassment charges. At this point, Gary was seething. He couldn't intimidate Cass physically, so he tried to turn the community against him. It started with rumors. Neighbors mentioned hearing that Cass was suing people left and right, that he was a city boy who didn't understand how things worked here. Then, anonymous complaints were filed against Cass with the county. Petty accusations like his fence being too tall, his property being an eyesore, and even a claim that he was running an illegal business out of his home. Cass received a visit from county inspectors who checked everything. They left empty-handed. He was in full compliance with every regulation. Still, the very act of being investigated left a bad taste in his mouth. Gary, on the other hand, was enjoying every second of it. Cass could see him watching from his front porch, grinning as inspectors walked the property. The man wanted a reaction, but Cass wasn't about to give him one. Instead of engaging, Cass dug into Gary's past. Using public records, he discovered that Gary had a long history of bending zoning laws. His construction business had been shut down due to permit violations, and his real estate projects were riddled with legal disputes. Cass hired a lawyer and launched his own investigation. Within days, they uncovered that Gary's property wasn't up to code. His guest house was built without a permit, and his septic system was out of compliance. Cass made sure the county knew. Inspectors showed up at Gary's door just as they had at Cass's, only this time there were actual violations. Gary was slapped with a $10,000 fine and ordered to bring his property up to code or face demolition orders. For the first time, Cass saw real anger in Gary's eyes. The man had played petty games, but Cass had hit him where it hurt, his wallet and his ego. The war had escalated, and this time, Gary was ready to hit back hard. Gary Vendorn was not the type to accept defeat gracefully. Cass's legal counterattack had struck where it hurt most, his wallet and pride. The fines, the permit violations, the county forcing him to make costly repairs, it all pushed Gary closer to the edge. And when men like him felt cornered, they lashed out. Cass had expected retaliation, but he hadn't anticipated just how far Gary was willing to go. One crisp morning, Cass stepped outside to check his land and froze in his tracks. His entire back fence, 300 feet of sturdy wood and wire, had been torn down. The posts were ripped from the ground, the boards shattered, as if someone had gone at them with a crowbar. His dogs, usually confined to his yard, were now wandering near the tree line, sniffing at the destruction. Cass's stomach tightened. He knew who had done this. Checking his security footage confirmed it. Gary and two men in work gloves, destroying the fence under the cover of night. They laughed, high-fived, and one even relieved himself on the remains of the broken wood. Cass clenched his fists. This wasn't just vandalism, it was a declaration of war. Without hesitation, Cass sent the footage to his lawyer and filed criminal charges for property destruction. This wasn't a fine or a civil dispute, it was a felony-level offense due to the cost of the damage. A sheriff's deputy knocked on Gary's door that evening with a formal summons. But instead of remorse, Gary smirked. Gotta prove it in court, he sneered. Good luck. Cass wasn't worried about proving it. He had the footage. Gary was officially facing criminal charges, and that should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. A week after the fence destruction, Cass was working in his barn when he heard a gunshot. Not unusual in the area, people hunted deer and small game all the time. But this shot, it was close. Too close. Then he heard it, a bullet striking wood, sending splinters flying near his truck. Cass ducked, adrenaline surging. He crouched behind the barn wall, waiting. Silence. Then another shot, this time embedding itself in a nearby tree. His security cameras were rolling, and later, when he checked the footage, he saw Gary standing just beyond the property line, rifle in hand. A sheriff's deputy arrived within the hour, but Gary had an excuse ready. "Just hunting, officer. Didn't realize I was so close to his property," he said with a smug grin. There wasn't enough evidence to prove it was intentional, but Cass knew. Gary wasn't trying to kill him. He was trying to scare him into submission. That night, Cass slept with his own rifle by the door. Gary had crossed the line into real danger now, and Cass was done playing defense. Cass had always believed in handling conflicts legally, keeping things civil where possible. But Gary had pushed beyond civility. The fence destruction, the veiled threats with gunfire, these weren't the acts of a man looking to settle a dispute. They were the moves of a man who refused to lose. Cass knew one thing for sure. Gary wasn't done. He reinforced his security, installed more cameras, added motion sensor floodlights, and even set up a perimeter alarm. But deep down, he knew that none of it would stop Gary, only catch him in the act. He didn't have to wait long. It was 2:47 a.m. when Cass's phone buzzed with an alert. Motion detected near the barn. Cass bolted upright, grabbing his phone and pulling up the security feed. His blood ran cold. A figure in dark clothing was crouched near the side of the barn, flicking a lighter over a bundle of rags. A moment later, the rags ignited. Cass barely had time to react before flames roared to life, spreading fast. The intruder ran toward a waiting truck, and as Cass squinted at the footage, he caught a glimpse of the driver, Gary. Cass grabbed his rifle and rushed outside, but it was already too late to stop the fire. He dialed 911, barely able to get the words out. "Arson, my property. Get a fire crew here now." Flames engulfed the barn, the dry wood feeding the inferno. Sparks flew into the night sky as the heat became unbearable. Cass's tools, feedstock, and backup generator gone in minutes. By the time the firefighters arrived, the structure was beyond saving. But Cass didn't care about the barn. He cared about nailing Gary for this. While the firefighters worked, Cass handed his security footage over to the sheriff's office. He was done playing games. Gary had committed felony arson, a serious crime with real prison time. The footage showed everything. Gary's truck idling at the edge of the road, the masked figure lighting the fire, the quick getaway. But Cass wasn't done. He wanted more. With his lawyer's help, Cass began digging into Gary's past financials, his former business dealings, and his legal history. What they found was worse than he expected: unpaid debts, lawsuits from former clients, violations for illegal construction practices. Gary wasn't just reckless, he was a career fraudster, and now he was about to face his biggest reckoning yet. The next day, law enforcement showed up at Gary's door with a warrant. Cass stood on his porch, watching from a distance as Gary emerged, looking disheveled and furious. He shouted at the officers, cursing Cass's name, but they didn't care, because this wasn't just a fine. This wasn't just a civil case. This was prison time. Cass had won. And Gary? Gary was finished. Gary Van Dorn had been a thorn in Cass's side for months, but after the barn fire and his arrest for arson, Cass believed that things were finally over. The security footage had been undeniable, the charges were serious, and law enforcement had taken him away in handcuffs. But men like Gary, they never go down without a final act of desperation. Bailed out by a shady acquaintance, Gary was released pending trial. It was clear that he had lost everything. His money was drying up, his land was under scrutiny from the county, and now he was facing years in prison. A rational man would have cut his losses. But Gary wasn't rational. Gary was vindictive, and he wasn't finished with Cass. Cass had spent the last few days working with his lawyer and the authorities, ensuring that Gary would never set foot on his land again. He reinforced his home's security system, replaced the burned fencing, and even had the county sheriff on speed dial. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened that night. It was around 11:30 p.m. when Cass's perimeter alarm tripped. Not just once. Multiple sensors. Cass shot up from his desk, his pulse hammering. He grabbed his rifle and pulled up the security feed on his phone. Gary was on the property. Only this time, he wasn't alone. Cass's breath caught as he saw two men in dark clothing moving toward the house, staying low. One held a crowbar, the other a handgun. And Gary was right behind them, a cold look in his eyes. This wasn't like the other times. This wasn't petty vandalism. This was something else entirely. Cass had seconds to react. He hit 911 on his phone and whispered, "Home invasion in progress. 3 armed men. Send units now." Then he grabbed his rifle and took position near the front door. The men moved fast. Cass heard the crunch of boots on gravel, then the scraping sound of metal against wood as they tried to force open the back door. Gary's low voice carried through the night. "Hurry up, we don't have all night." Cass's hands tightened on his rifle. This wasn't just a scare tactic anymore. Gary was done playing games. They were here to hurt him. Cass took a deep breath, then flipped on the floodlights. A blinding blast of white light exploded over the property, cutting through the darkness. The intruders froze. Cass didn't hesitate. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle raised. "Don't move." His voice was steady, cold. "The cops are on their way. You take one step closer, and I will defend my home." The 2 armed men panicked first. One of them, the guy with the crowbar, dropped it and bolted, sprinting toward the tree line. The other hesitated, glancing at Gary, then made his decision. He ran too. Gary was left standing alone, his face twisting in rage. Cass leveled the rifle at him. "You're done, Gary. Drop to your knees. Hands where I can see them." For a split second, Cass saw the calculation in Gary's eyes. Would he fight? Would he run? Then, sirens split the night, loud, getting closer. Gary's face twisted in pure hatred, but he knew he was finished. With one final glare, he spat on the ground and slowly raised his hands. Seconds later, 3 squad cars roared onto the property, tires kicking up dust. Deputies flooded out, weapons drawn. Cass finally lowered his rifle as the officers swarmed Gary, slamming him to the ground. It was over, for real this time. Gary wasn't just facing arson charges anymore. He was now charged with armed trespassing, attempted breaking and entering, conspiracy to commit assault, and possession of a firearm as a felon. It was more than enough to send him away for decades. As the officers hauled Gary to his feet, bruised and defeated, he turned one last time to look at Cass. And for the first time, Cass saw something new in his eyes. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't arrogance. It was fear. Cass met his gaze with calm resolve. "You picked the wrong man to mess with." Gary lowered his head, and as the cops shoved him into the back of a squad car, Cass finally let himself take a deep, steady breath. It was over. For good. For the first time in months, Cass could finally breathe. As the police hauled Gary away, the reality of it all sank in. It had been a long, brutal fight, one that had escalated far beyond property disputes or petty harassment. What started with a few cut-down trees had transformed into a full-blown war, ending with a man in handcuffs and a long list of criminal charges. Cass had stood his ground. He had refused to back down, refused to be bullied, and now justice was catching up to Gary Vendern. But it wasn't over just yet. There were still court cases to settle, repairs to make, and loose ends to tie up before Cass could finally put this nightmare behind him. Over the next few months, Gary's world collapsed. Cass attended every court hearing, watching as Gary's smug arrogance gave way to nervous tension. The list of charges stacked high: arson, attempted breaking and entering, conspiracy to commit assault, illegal firearm possession, and more. The security footage from the barn fire, the trespassing attempt, and even the damaged fence left no room for doubt. Gary had no way out. His former lawyers, once eager to defend him in civil cases, abandoned him when it became clear that this wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a criminal trial. When sentencing day finally came, Cass sat in the courtroom as the judge handed down the final verdict. 15 years in prison. Gary barely reacted, as if he had already accepted his fate. His shoulders slumped, his once defiant sneer replaced by quiet defeat. He glanced at Cass one last time. Cass didn't flinch. Not this time. Gary Vendorn was finally out of his life. With Gary in prison, the county seized his property due to unpaid legal fees and mounting debts. Cass watched from a distance as the land was put up for auction, knowing that whoever bought it would be a step up from its previous owner. A local rancher ended up purchasing it, planning to restore the land and use it for sustainable farming. Cass met the new owner, a quiet, easygoing man named Joel, and instantly knew that things were going to be different this time. No more fences torn down, no more trash dumped in the yard, no more gunshots in the night. Just peace. The kind of peace Cass had wanted all along. With Gary gone, Cass could finally focus on restoring what had been damaged. He rebuilt the barn, stronger and more secure than before. He replaced the burned fencing with reinforced steel posts, ensuring that no one would ever try to tear it down again. He upgraded his security system, installing automated floodlights, a reinforced gate, and high-definition cameras covering every inch of the property. And most importantly, he got his life back. For the first time in over a year, Cass woke up without the nagging feeling of dread. His home, his land, was finally his again. No more looking over his shoulder, no more lawyers, police reports, or courtrooms, just his land, his work, and his well-earned freedom. One evening, as Cass sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the tree line, he thought about everything he had been through. What had started as a simple property dispute had turned into a battle for survival. And through it all, he had never backed down. Cass realized something important. People like Gary existed everywhere. People who thought they could take, manipulate, and intimidate their way through life. People who assumed they could push others around without consequence, but they only got away with it if no one stood up to them. Cass had fought back, not with violence, not with revenge, but with the law, persistence, and sheer determination. And in the end, he had won. As the stars appeared overhead, Cass leaned back in his chair, a quiet smile on his face. The war was over, and he was still standing. The morning air was crisp as Cass stepped outside, taking in the sight of his newly restored property. It had been a long road to get here. Months of stress, legal battles, destruction, and fear had pushed him to his limits. But now, as he watched the sunrise paint the treetops in golden hues, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. No more looking over his shoulder, no more waiting for the next act of sabotage or the next court summons. Gary Vendorn was gone, locked away where he could no longer cause harm. His land, his reputation, and his twisted sense of entitlement had all crumbled under the weight of his own actions. Cass took a deep breath, letting the stillness settle over him. It was over. But what had it all meant? And what had he learned from the war he had been forced to fight? Cass never wanted to be the guy constantly battling his neighbor. He wasn't looking for conflict when all of this started. All he had wanted was to live his life, tend to his land, and enjoy the quiet he had worked so hard for. Instead, he had been dragged into a war of boundaries and principles, forced to fight for what was rightfully his. And while he had won, it wasn't without a cost. Financially, he had spent thousands on legal fees, property repairs, and increased security. Emotionally, the stress had been exhausting, forcing him to stay constantly alert, always expecting the worst. Time, perhaps the most valuable resource, had been stolen from him by a man who simply refused to accept defeat with dignity. But even knowing all that, Cass wouldn't have done a single thing differently, because the alternative? Letting Gary win, letting him believe that intimidation, destruction, and sheer stubbornness could allow him to take what he wanted from others. That was never an option. Cass had stood his ground. And in doing so, he had set a precedent, not just for himself, but for anyone who found themselves in a similar situation. At first, when Gary was still free, the local community had been split. Some had believed his lies and manipulations, thinking Cass was just an outsider causing unnecessary trouble. Others had remained neutral, not wanting to get involved. But once the truth came out, once they saw the security footage, the arson evidence, the police reports detailing his violent escalation, opinions changed. People who had once been distant now approached Cass, offering apologies, support, and even help in rebuilding. The new owner of Gary's land, Joel, had stopped by just a week ago. "He really did a number on you, huh?" Joel had said, shaking his head. "Don't worry, I'm not here to cause trouble, just want to be a good neighbor." Cass had appreciated that. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't on guard when meeting someone new. The cycle of hostility had finally ended. Sitting on his porch that evening, Cass thought about everything he had taken away from this experience. Lesson number 1, never ignore red flags. The moment Gary cut down those first trees, Cass should have known this wasn't going to be a simple disagreement. He had tried to handle it civilly, but people like Gary don't respect civility. They see it as weakness. If someone disrespects your boundaries from the start, assume they'll do it again. Lesson number 2, Documentation is everything. Cass won because he had proof. Security footage, legal paperwork, police reports, it all built a case that was impossible to ignore. When dealing with a malicious neighbor, never rely on word of mouth or good faith. Get everything in writing. Lesson number 3. Bullies only win if you let them. Gary tried to intimidate, harass, and manipulate Cass into backing down. But Cass refused to give up his rights, and that's why he won. Lesson number 4. The law works if you use it correctly. Many people believe that the legal system takes too long or favors the wrong people, but Cass learned that if you're persistent, patient, and armed with the right evidence, justice prevails. Gary's downfall wasn't because Cass got lucky. It was because Cass knew the law, followed the process, and refused to quit. Now, with everything behind him, Cass had a new perspective on life. The war with Gary had tested his patience, his resilience, and his will to fight for what was his. But in the end, he had won. And the most satisfying part, he never had to stoop to Gary's level to do it. As the stars blinked to life above the rolling hills of his land, Cass finally felt at peace. This was his home, his land, and no one was ever going to take that from him again.